I'm reading from the book All the Women of the Bible, and this is the story of Eve and the First Fruits, Part 3. It was just before sunset when Eve heard the sounds she had been waiting for, 2 sets of footsteps approaching the door. She turned her mouth open to speak her son's name, to ask if he had found his brother, and saw Cain silhouetted in the doorway, Adam behind him, grim and watchful, though she had not taken that in at that moment. Cain, she began, reaching for him, then stopped. Cain's clothing was splashed with something dark, and so were his hands. He was standing stiffly as if he would collapse if he relaxed a single muscle. His whole being screamed pain. "Are you hurt?" she had cried. "Cain, what happened? Abel?" Then, growing cold and still, she knew what had happened as clearly as if she had been standing there watching, seeing what Cain, his voice lifeless, his face fixed in horror, was telling her. She saw Abel hailing Cain, heard the older brother invite the younger to go with him, and watched them travel into the open country. She saw Cain's rage overmaster him, saw him batter his brother to death, hitting him over and over until Abel's blood soaked into the ground and not a bone of him remained whole. And she saw Cain running, collapsing in exhaustion under a tree. She heard with him the voice of the Lord questioning him, asking him where his brother Abel was. Heard Cain answering with the sneer he used to mask his feelings, in this case terror, if he were supposed to be his brother's keeper. And she heard the Lord God's reply as if he were speaking it here in their presence. "What have you done? Listen to the sound of your brother's blood, crying out to me from the ground. Now be accursed and driven from the ground that has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood at your hands. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield you any of its produce. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer over the earth." She had frozen at that. Time had seemed to stand still. It was over. Everything was over. Things could be no worse, and they could not be fixed. So why was Cain still talking? Eve had to force herself to breathe, to attend, to hear the words, though she knew even then that she wasn't really taking them in. And it wasn't Cain, but Adam, she realized, who was speaking now. His voice was harsh, grating with emotions she could not untangle. Anger, certainly, and deep pain, and something else. He had, it seemed, found Abel's body, and torn between horror and rage, had followed the trail of the killer's headlong flight. He had arrived at the tree in time to hear Cain's protest to the Lord God at the sentence he had passed. The punishment was too harsh, Cain had protested, since he was no longer able to till the soil, and he would have to avoid the Lord God's presence. He would have to become one of the fugitives of the earth, and anyone who met him would consider him fair game. He would be hunted to his death. Even in her stunned state, Eve marveled, horrified at her firstborn's audacity. Who would dare speak so to the Lord God? Yet Cain was still standing, still alive. What on earth had happened? His father's voice had gone on. The Lord God said that if anyone killed him, he would be avenged sevenfold, and then the Lord God put his mark on him to prevent anyone who might come across him from killing him. Adam paused. He was going to go away right then, but I told him he had to tell you what he had done. Himself, he added. Cain had met her eyes, his own dead, then dropped them. He shook his head slightly and was still. That seemed to be all of the story. Eve waited. The silence was leaden. Finally, Cain had cleared his throat, looked at her dully, and said dully, "I have to go away. Now." Eve had nodded and, blindly reaching for a woven bag, had begun mechanically to fill it with the hearth cakes she had made that interminable day. She felt nothing at all. Adam, his movements precise, his face expressionless, had filled another bag with Cain's clothing, a small sack of grain, some vegetables, and a sharp knife with its sharpening stone. He had handed the bag to Cain with a stout walking staff and a filled water skin. Cain shouldered his bag and hung the water skin from its cord around his neck. He planted the staff in the dirt and leaned his weight on it. He sighed and opened his mouth, but seemed to think better of it. Sorry, Eve thought she heard, but she had never been sure. She handed him the bag of hearth cakes and touched his cheek. Cain, she began, but he dropped his eyes and the words died before she could even think them. At the last moment, Adam had reached out and touched Cain's arm. Son, he said, but nothing followed. And other than giving a slight shiver, Cain showed no sign of having heard. The light caught Cain's face as, at last, he turned to go, and his parents could see the protective mark of the Lord God on his forehead. It was their last memory of him. Though they did learn much later he had settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden, had married and fathered a son who founded a town and continued the family. They had never seen him again nor heard from him. That night, with Abel now buried in the field behind the house and Cain gone without hope of return, Adam and Eve found themselves alone as they had not been since the disaster in the garden. They had begun to talk about what had happened, about why it had happened. As they looked at it all, it had seemed to Eve that somehow Cain's deed was the same as their choice in their garden, but 1,000 times worse. Or maybe not. Maybe it was the same choice they had made themselves. They had made themselves God through greed and ambition by eating the fruit. Cain had made himself God by dealing death to his brother through fear and envy. And now, like them, he had to leave his home, the only one he had ever known. Die the death, she had said to Adam. Death is the first fruit of the tree. Now Cain has to die the death too, by living and suffering and realizing what he has done to Abel and to us and to himself, the way we did. Adam had nodded. And still do, he said, over and over again. Have you begun to die yet? With Abel and with Cain? And die to rage at Abel for dying and at Cain for killing him? It's coming, you know. We can't escape. No, Eve had answered slowly. I haven't. I haven't even begun to feel, but I know I will. And that dying will not end any more than the dying from the garden has. Adam had sighed then, much as Cain had done just before he left them. No, he said, it won't. But maybe, his voice trailed off. While we live, she had said finally, we can hope. And the Lord God did show him mercy, in a way, protecting him from those who would kill him as he protected us. So maybe Cain will learn. Maybe he will find his peace. Maybe we will too. They had joined then in sorrow and in a love deeper than any they had known, and in that joining, Eve had conceived Seth. When he was born, she had welcomed him as the child the Lord God had given her to fill Abel's place, and felt the first faint thread of healing begin. Seth had been a joy to her and Adam, not a substitute for Abel, nor a wiping out of Cain's deed, but entirely the Lord God's gift of comfort to them in himself, as himself, and they had loved him so. His son Enosh was their delight, and Eve smiled to see him, curled up asleep on her old cloak, which he carried with him everywhere. That's the end, as ever and as always. I'm so glad you exist. I am proud of you, and I love you. And I hope you never ever forget that you are enough, you matter, you are worthy, and you are perfect. Please follow for more if you enjoy.